So very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Brady Robards. I'm stepping in to facilitate this session today in the absence of Simon Copland, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but thank you to Simon for the work that he put into organising this session on digital methods organised by TASA for ECRs and postgrads. I know there are a few members of that TASA subcommittee, postgraduate subcommittee, who are here with us today, so hello and thank you to those folks as well. And a reminder that this first part of this session will be recorded, so everyone please be aware of that. So I want to start out by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're coming to this meeting separately from today. I'm personally on the land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I want to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. And I think we can all, for those of us in Australia and different parts of the world, we can reflect on the ongoing and enduring impacts of colonisation in our lives and in the lives of Indigenous people around the world, but especially here in Australia. We do live and work on land where sovereignty was never ceded, and that is an enduring kind of impact. So welcome to those of you who are just joining us. A reminder that this session is recorded, and my name's Brady and I'm stepping in for Simon. But I really want to get to our very impressive and important panel. Today's session is on digital methods, and the topic for this session actually came out of an earlier postgraduate session that was organised by Ben Lyall, which was very early on in the pandemic, in the start of the corona times. And there was a question from the group that was like, how do we go on in this situation in terms of methods for those of us that are in the field or looking at doing research in the next little while? How do we stay in the field when we're physically separated? So we thought it would be a great opportunity to assemble some fantastic scholars from around the country, from different areas of research and also at different career stages, to talk to us about digital methods. So to answer these, we've got some pre-prepared questions that I'm going to start with that Simon prepared for us, and then towards the end of the session we're going to open up for open question and answer and discussion. So we're going to record that first part, and then we'll go off the recording so people can be a bit more open, frank, and have more open discussions without the shackles of the future weighing them down in terms of what gets recorded. So let me introduce our panel. First, we have the incredible Dr Crystal Abidin, who is an anthropologist and ethnographer of digital cultures. Crystal's a senior research fellow at Curtin University. We also have the wonderful Dr Akane Kanai. Akane is a lecturer in media studies at Monash with a background in sociology, and Akane works on gender and the media and digital self-representation and self-branding. Our third speaker, who is no stranger around these here TASA parts as a past member of the TASA exec, Dr Shanthi Robertson is an associate professor at Western Sydney University with a very impressive profile in transnational migration, citizenship and multiculturalism. And last but not least, thank you so much to Dr Ben Lyall, who is a sociologist at Monash in the area of digital health, self-tracking and wearable technology. We asked Ben to join us very last minute, so thank you, Ben, for agreeing to do that. Ben's PhD was only conferred earlier this year, so he brings a really important ECR and immediately post-PhD perspective to our discussion, which I think is really important. So let's get straight into it. Our first question, and again, we have a few questions pre-prepared, but we're really keen to get your questions as well. So you can either type them in the chat as we go, if it's related to something that we're talking about, or I can invite you towards the end of the discussion to ask your questions and contribute your own expertise as well. We want the second part to be quite open. So our first question is really a sort of introductory question. Can you tell us a bit about how you've incorporated digital methods into your own research? So I'm going to ask Crystal to start us off.
Thanks, Brady. My original training and background was in sociology and anthropology, and then since then I've landed into the business school, cultural studies, communication and media, and I'm now housed in a department or a discipline of internet studies. I primarily study internet celebrity and influencer cultures, so to begin with, my research field is extremely online. I have to use digital methods because the things I study, the people I study are online. But to make this more diverse, I think I will cover very briefly 3 different types of my projects and the 3 reasons I've incorporated digital methods. So the first, looking at influencers and internet celebrities, I primarily study what they do on the internet, as well as the environment of what constructs their persona offline, which means this has required me to do digital ethnography online, as well as corroborating and triangulating this with offline participant observation, interviews, small group chats, and the like. The second thing I primarily study is social media pop cultures. So we may know this primarily as memes, viral videos, stickers, and all the fun things above and beyond mere text that we use to communicate with each other online. Likewise, these are also online native or digital native phenomena. So to study them, I primarily use content analysis. Every now and then, sometimes visual analysis or textual analysis, but it's never really quite clear, this divide, because say if you're looking through a transcript of a text message, it's quite impossible to separate the emoji or the stickers that carry meaning and emotion apart from the long text that they're appended to. The last of my research programs looks at grief, sometimes requiring young people to tell me a bit about their deepest feelings that are difficult to navigate. And while I have done face-to-face interviews, this is always an option I give all my participants. Should they decide that they would like us to speak in a digital format, online, whether through video chat, on the phone, or even through texting, I'm very happy to oblige with that. This particular project was very interesting to me because I found that for some informants with whom over many years I've done all these different methods, texting has always been the most precious to me. It felt like the most intimate. It also felt like it was the most free-flowing because they answered my questions on Messenger or on Telegram or WhatsApp as and when it suited them. And sometimes these responses matched the rhythms of their daily life. They could come at 3 in the morning, and that was when it was really rich, deep data that they were also happy for me to share. But it was face-to-face on camera. I got so much access to behind the scenes of their environment. And say if they were telling me about a lost loved one, they would reach to grab an object and show it to me. Whereas if I had artificially created for us to meet in a face-to-face environment, say in a cafe, these paratexts would not be there to prompt them. So some of this are my intentional incorporations of why I want to use digital methods. Others are out of convenience, and others I've left my informants to choose. And I think I'll hand the time over to Shanthi.
Hi everyone, great to see you all. So I think unlike some members of the panel, my research focus isn't necessarily digital worlds, digital lives, or the digital space, but most of my research has been with highly mobile populations. So the challenge across my research and my career has been, how do you replicate some form of ethnographic or longitudinal qualitative method with people who are on the move, where there isn't one field site that you can visit to observe, and individual participants are also kind of highly mobile and might be located in many different places at different times over the course of the research project. So, to that end, I've experimented a lot with, I guess, what are sometimes called mobile methods, which often have a digital component, and just sort of used digital tools and digital methods as a way to maintain contact with research participants, no matter where they might be. Some of the specific methods I've looked at include cultural probes, which I originally used in my PhD as quite an analogue method. That's when participants are provided with a kind of packet of creative resources that they use to conduct creative self-documentation activities. So it's almost a way to observe through self-documentation without having to be there. Back in the day when I did my PhD, this was done with like a physical packet of objects, but often these days a cultural probe is done as a digital probe where people are actually completing the prompts and activities using a smartphone, for example. My more recent projects, I've also done a lot of video interviews on Skype and Zoom, and experimented with other forms of participant self-documentation and asking participants to provide texts, objects, artifacts from their own lives. So often it's kind of a blend of methods you might be familiar with, like photo elicitation. And in my postdoctoral research, I used some of these artifacts along with interview data to create digital exhibits of participant stories, which you can find on my website. That was kind of less of a digital method and more as, I guess, a creative digital output from the research as well. Yeah, and I guess my current major project, because it's dealing with transnationally mobile young people, pretty much all of the methods have an online component, the survey, the mobile ethnography and the interviews. And in that project, we're experimenting with a purpose-built mobile ethnography app called Indemo, which allows for that process of self-documentation to occur via a smartphone application. It's been a lot of experimenting, I would say, rather than a very strategically defined agenda, but it's been productive.
Thanks, Shanthi. Ben?
Hello, thank you. I just wanted to flag early on that I hope none of like what I am about to say is sort of taken as like unequivocal support for people continuing their work in a business as usual kind of environment. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about pivoting to digital means of doing the work that we all do, but like I think it's a perfectly valid time to have like difficulties and confusions, and those should be examined and taken on board by everybody, and not just immediately be looking for, you know, quick and easy solutions to very, very complex problems that everyone's facing at the moment. Anyway, yeah, I think to echo Shanthi and Crystal in different ways, I probably would say my work and interest areas are more like digitally informed than they are straight up digital methods. So yeah, I am like Shanthi, I tend to sort of have added components to existing types of methods in order to interrogate digital problems and questions. So a lot of that has involved mediating interviews with self-tracking devices and I guess data in different ways, but that often sometimes kind of takes on this visual form, acting maybe, you know, a little bit similarly to some of those other methods that have been mentioned in terms of people being able to kind of bring objects with them and use those as kind of prompts in that interview and discussion kind of environment. And similarly, I've also used like a little bit of light data scraping kind of stuff to then primarily be used as a more straightforward content analysis. So it was more about a way of capturing the data in that kind of context. So for me, it's usually about kind of filling an existing gap that I've found in what I've been doing that's helped me to like interrogate the problem further. More recently too, there's been a large-scale project that I've been working on that's involved focus groups that shifted online because of the current COVID situation. So that has been really interesting and insightful for kind of methods reasons. And it really struck a lot of the stuff that Crystal mentioned, where you can kind of, I don't know, almost kind of stretch out the kind of relationship you have with participants and build rapport in ways that are a little bit more fluid and natural than maybe what we sort of learn early on in our studies about methods. And you can, yeah, you can feel a little bit more human with how you approach people because you have this intermediate technology that is being shared by everyone in that space, and I think that's really valuable as well.
Akane, thanks, Ben.
First off, I'm really blown away by the fact there are so many people here. So thanks for joining today, and I hope we can contribute, you know, I don't know, just some questions, thoughts of interest, because we all have kind of different backgrounds and experiences with, you know, so-called digital methods. As Brady knows, I've often not really called myself a real digital person. I think that's because I've always been really interested. I think gender's been one of the primary questions I've been really interested in, gender, race and feeling. And so because I've always thought of that first, I haven't really thought of the digital. But I think generally most people here are sociologists or have some background in sociology, and I think, you know, you're probably all interested in what people do. So essentially, I think it's useful to think about what we do in relation to whether our questions oscillate more between looking at a culture versus looking at people's practices. And obviously these are intertwined, but in my first real project, my PhD project, I was really interested in, I guess, what was more a cultural focus. I was interested in these Tumblr reaction GIF accounts that would be using GIFs to express feelings and emotions. And I was so curious as to how the use of these very kind of snappy captions and GIFs really could tell us so much about what feelings for young women were deemed to be common, relatable, average, and likable, basically. So that actually focused much more on a visual kind of textual analysis, thinking about what kind of feelings we were asked to participate in as spectators. So having the sort of producer-spectator relation sort of firmly foregrounded there. But as I've gone on and I've done more work on projects on feminism and feminist identity, I've also employed methods of individual interviews, because I just noticed from my own experience that often online discussions about feminism often seem to be quite fraught, not just in open spaces where there's, you know, open racism, misogyny, etc., but also just in general, people being very careful with how they use their words. So I used individual face-to-face interviews, but also asked people to, I don't know, share particular stories, objects, their feeds with me when I was interviewing them. And in the most recent project that I've been working on, which is about online feminist deliberation, knowing that I didn't want to sort of just join groups that I wasn't part of and just observe what was going on as a stranger and someone that was sort of outside of that group, even though, you know, I am a feminist and, you know, otherwise might correspond to the demographic. What my collaborator Julia Coffey from Newcastle and I have done have organised workshops that were face-to-face, had kind of more traditional kind of feminist circle type thing where people sit around and they can see each other's faces and they kind of model deliberation in a way. So it's sort of the process helps them to also reflect on how online discussion and disagreement happens, and we've done that, I guess. We've also done sort of follow-up interviews following that, with asking people to share online encounters with us. But that two-stage model, I think, was also a way to try to get at feelings and things that also, you know, are difficult to say in group environments. So I think those are just some sort of contextual factors around how I've, conducted these projects.
Thanks, Akane. And I think those 4 introductions give us a really neat sense of the kind of diversity in methods being used amongst our panel, and also this point about where we start. So, you know, people have variously described themselves as whether they do digital methods or where the boundaries of digital methods are. You know, thinking about Crystal's starting point as the digital, and other people starting from, well, I'm interested in this topic. How do I understand it through the digital movements that people make? So I think that's a really useful, actually. And for those in the room who don't think of themselves as you know, digital sociologists or as having any expertise in those kinds of methods, that's totally fine as well, because that's what this session is about, to kind of share some learning and resources. So given those starting points, the second question we had was, what have you gained from using these methods? And what are the kinds of limitations of them, I suppose? So we might flip the order, and I'll ask Akane to start us off this time.
I'm not really sure I'm going to say in relation to this, but I think, again, it really starts from your question and what you want to do. So anything that you gain is really in service of the kind of parameters that you set to start off with. I think the methods themselves have been really useful, and personally I really like, in terms of doing sort of identity kind of analysis, I do really love the interview and the sort of face-to-face element, which is not always possible, obviously. And I'm actually really curious to hear from Ben later how some of the more the practicalities of online focus groups. But I think giving people the opportunity to tell their stories, however you do it, is really powerful in trying to think through the contradictions they face, the negotiations, and bringing up things they didn't even realize themselves. So I think that's that's what I really enjoy, I guess, about those kinds of methods that feel a bit more, give your respondents the ability to sort of speak for themselves. But actually, I think that in terms of the methods are really important, but the theory you use is just as important in terms of what you get out of it. And I think sometimes if you use more sort of textual analysis, sometimes the distinction between theory and method is quite blurred, but I think that can also really inform what you get out of a particular method. And my interest in sort of theories of affect has been really helpful in getting the most out of each method that I've used.
Well, Akane's given you a good segue there, Ben. Do you want to talk about this process of flipping those focus groups online? You've just finished a whole swag of them. What have you learned there? What are the limitations? What have you gained and lost?
That wasn't what I was going to talk about, but I will now. It's definitely right in the sweet spot of the losses and gains, I think, particularly for focus groups where, you're kind of treading a line between getting the kind of detail you want from a one-on-one and then something at scale more. And you definitely have to wind back the scale and what you expect from the discussion between people based on the various, affordances that you're using, different platforms, or whether it's people's internet access, the speed of their connection, the comfort of which they have with sharing their camera and the rooms behind them, or the noise they've got going around. It becomes really an issue of practicality more than anything. And I think it actually worked quite well for this project because we really did wind back the expectations we had. So things as simple as cutting the numbers down from 5 to 3 as an expectation, and just softening up some of the rigidities that we kind of had in our lines of thinking around questions that we wanted to ask and stuff, and sort of being pretty flexible in the orders in which we went in order to really try and facilitate a flowing conversation as best we could in these environments that, attempt to be synchronous but quite often become asynchronous. It's also really been useful for, I said this before, but maybe I didn't quite think it through properly, this kind of stretching out of connection with people. It's very useful for the practicalities around ethics, explanatory statements, consent forms, incentives, reimbursements, that type of stuff. If you be really patient with it, I think it pays off because you can approach people a long way out from something and slowly give them the information, and they have the chance to, take it or leave it. And you do lose people sometimes, but I think that becomes the way that rapport can kind of be built. And then, the peak of that is the interaction you have down the camera to someone, and then tapers off again in a similar kind of way where you can respond, follow up with people, ask questions and things. So I think it really does come down to the nitty-gritties of the practicalities within that. Some of the other maybe more concrete losses are really just around data quality and stuff that can happen with any type of research, really. It's just a matter of here that it's about, audio quality and transcription and stuff rather than, losing a data set from a different type of, form.
Sorry, I didn't mean to direct you only to that topic. Feel free to say other things that, in terms of.
I was going to say one other quick thing. I just in my other work, a really good gain, I think, is to double down on what I said at the start. This shared intermediary kind of idea. So the tools you're using kind of do a little bit of the work for you in terms of bridging gaps that you may have with the people you're speaking to. And I learn a lot about things that, I don't know, speak to abilities and languages and stuff that I didn't really expect to through that, and becomes a work of both figurative and literal translation in many ways, because the participant is able to explain to you something that would have taken so much more work in any other way, but you can see how it is going into the service or the platform or the tool that you're using and coming out again, because you've already done the kind of background work and they've already done their interpretive work on what the tool is for, and so you've got that nicely sitting there in the middle between you to act as a mediator.
You mean in terms of like visuals?
Yeah, it can be visuals, but it doesn't have to be quite as direct as that. It can also just be about the practices that come with that, and then you find out how that differs for various reasons, whether it's just personal preference or something cultural, or yeah.
Shanthi?
Thanks, Brady. I think, rather than the sort of nitty-gritty data collection stuff Ben's talked about, I might approach this question in a more macro sense. But I did want to take a sec, if we're talking about things that we've lost, to piggyback a little off Ben's response to the first question. I know there's probably a lot of people potentially in this Zoom who have had their fieldwork really badly disrupted by the global pandemic, and I think all of these discussions about research continuity and pivoting to new methods and approaches, I just want to acknowledge it really sucks. Like, I'm so sorry if you're not getting to do the project that you set out to do, and if that's been difficult and stressful, like, have your moment to sort of feel that, because it is really, really hard. And hopefully, in question time, if there's people struggling with particular aspects of that, really open to discussing it. In terms of losses and gains, I'll just keep it sort of big picture. I think I've gained a lot more than I've lost. From a career point of view, I think it's allowed me to be a lot more creative and innovative with my research. It's allowed me to have a different kind of relationship to both my collaborators and my research participants that is often more engaged, more collaborative, a little bit more experimental. In general, I think being a methods dork is a really good thing. I think it often allows you to connect with people outside of your own particular research topics and fields, because you find those aspects of commonality around method with someone who actually researches completely different topics and populations to you. Allows for some cross-disciplinary collaborations as well, which I've found really productive in my own career. Losses, I think there is still, and even in our own beloved field of sociology, there is still some kind of gatekeeping around what legitimate methods are. I think particularly, I do see my work as ethnographic, and I've experienced a bit of that uncomfortable boundary conversations about, what really constitutes ethnography. And if you're not doing long-term participant observation, both in reviews for grant applications, publications, etc., and in general feedback, I sometimes encounter some more traditional mindsets, I guess, around what sociological methods are meant to look like. That can sometimes be a bit uncomfortable, but you get practiced at speaking back to that, I think. And I think, also maybe the only other thing is sometimes you do face similar challenges when you get to the ethics stage. It's getting better as time progresses and as more and more researchers are engaging with the digital, but there still can sometimes be I think you need to have a good network of researchers around you and mentors that you can draw on who are familiar with these methods to help guide you through that process, because in some cases there aren't standard pro forma or template approaches to addressing some of those questions in ethics, I think. But on the whole, definitely gained a lot more than I've lost, and it's generally a pretty fun journey.
Crystal?
Sure. There's so much here. I'll probably touch on those that haven't been mentioned by my fellow panelists. If I can be supremely pragmatic, the biggest gain is job mobility. If your field site is online or your method is online, you are not constricted or confined to a specific locale. Like, even when I do fieldwork in specific regions, if, say, for some reason, for several months, I'm unable to travel, like now, I can pivot because digital methods are part of my training. But also in terms of job mobility, I think before landing this job, I worked in several cities across 3 continents. And I never really had to change my approach to research very much because it was a routine. Everything was accessible online. It's just my triangulation to this online population offline was slightly different. So my routines were not very much disrupted during that period of precarity of job hunting. I supremely echo Shanthi's sentiments around being able to collaborate with people across disciplines. That was really fun, really great. But also collaborating across languages or cultures or groups, and being able to do this sort of comparative research you may have never intended to do. Personally, the things I have gained as a researcher, I would think critical thinking, definitely. When you participate in digital methods, the amount of data is overwhelming, and there is always this sense of FOMO that you need to capture everything, especially if you are a quant researcher and you have the ability to download or scrape things at a large scale. but the ability to do so does not dictate your intention or your need to do so, because then you get lost in all the data. So when I do lo-fi methods, like, screen grabbing stories that I know will be disappearing, screen recording things that I know will be deleted in a minute because this is the style of how this person posts, I need to make decisions from my trained anthropological background to find out, what do I want to capture? What do I want to study? What is my research question? Where is this going? As opposed to just mass downloading and then wading through the coding later on. So that's been a very new experience for me. I never really expected to learn this, but when I entered my honors year in 2010, this is a new discovery that was fun. The other thing that was gained, I think, to echo Ben, again, is rapport and learning new ways to gain status and entry into an in-group or a community if you're studying them. Say, specific to this pandemic, most of the informants I've been studying have suddenly pivoted to Instagram Live, and I show up. If it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon, if I'm awake at 2 a.m. and they happen to be there, I know it's going to be a juicy Instagram Live. I show up and they acknowledge that. It also helps to have a consistent digital online persona, identity, or handle so that your informants recognize you. And this is something that I've done very intentionally from the start of my undergrad. So on to the losses, also connected with this. You lose a lot of time and privacy from having to construct this digital persona to engage with your informants. You also do need to invest sincerely as a human and as a caring person in maintaining these online relationships. It's not, every request does not have to be a work request. If you go through your text history and every time you text them is to ask them a follow-up question, think about how they would feel if this was a friend texting them. So I feel that I did have to make the effort to maintain rapport in this way as well, through brief check-ins, through honing my skills using paratext, emoji, stickers, etc. And then the last loss, if I can be really honest, is that my social life on social media has definitely been affected. Today, because I focus on East Asia and each of these countries has a different dominant social media app connected to that place, I have between 8 to 10 apps just for research, for social media and for messaging. And when these messages from my informants come in, I ignore everything else from my family and friends because that's not my focus. So I end up replying messages 4 to 5 days late or something like that. But it can also be very overwhelming to keep up online on your phone when that is your primary way of connecting with people. It's not like you log out from a focus group or interview and then go off and be your other person. There are expectations that if it's online, you are there, you reciprocate, you're available. And if the informant makes the initiative to write to you, even if it's outside of business hours, you are probably obliged as a good researcher to protect your rapport, to respond as well. So definitely I've had to learn a bit more about work-life balance and management. Something else I wanted to raise that I think we might be able to touch on later as a group, especially in light of COVID, is whether our methods are out of our personal politics, out of our sociological research questions, or out of sheer pragmatism and logistical reasons for this time. And this will help us to also assess, when we say, what do we gain from these methods? Are they merely placeholders for you to extract data? Like at the end of the day, are you only going to be looking at the interview transcript? Or are you going to use methods more meaningfully to also look at all the other types of texts and data available to you that come along with the conversation? So we might get to that in a bit later, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question, Crystal. And it kind of goes into our next question, which is on ethics, but maybe we can come back to that question later on about where methods come from around preferences and politics and so on. And I was also thinking about this point about boundary work that you mentioned. I think that's really important for us to come back to if we can. I know I see Claire Moran is in the group as well, and she's been working on this work around boundaries between participants and your own personal life, and how when you do digital methods, embedded ethnographic kind of approaches, and you're in touch with participants all the time, how that bleeds into your personal life too. So that might be something we can come back to. But our third question was around ethics, which Shanthi kind of hinted at before, and how ethics committees are dealing with digital methods that do have these blurred boundaries that aren't so common in more traditional interview-based work, for example. So I'd be keen to get the panel's thoughts on this question. People always ask me about ethics, from the ethics of doing interviews online to this kind of data scraping stuff that Ben spoke about before. So it would be great to get your reflections on the ethical issues of the methods you've mentioned. So again, we might reverse the order, and this time we'll go with Crystal first. Thanks, Crystal.
Sure. So maybe let's look at this in the 3 stages of any research project. One is the planning or the conceptualization. If you use digital methods, and for me in an extremely online space where your data is primarily online, accessibility is not the same as publicness or privacy. So just because you have something that's available to you doesn't mean it's available to you to study as a scholar. And context here is very important. So for instance, if I'm comparing 2 Instagram accounts, and one of them is owned by an influencer who's got thousands of followers, and I know they're intentionally public, then it might be easier for me to have a conversation with them or to rationalize that this is something I can study, because it is their ethos to be extremely public and to want to disseminate this. I also think about the consequences. If I were to publicize their account above and beyond their subcultural group, would this bring them more benefits or more harms? And for most of the people I study, most of the time, increased visibility equals increased income. So for this reason, when I have to prepare ethical documents, I sometimes wrestle with the office trying to convince them that I should not default to anonymity, and I would rather let my informants pick how they would like to be identified. Because for many of them, if I impose anonymity on them, I'm taking away some value that could have been generated out of our interactions, and they are just doing me a service. There is no reciprocity, and I feel like I'm just extracting value for them for my career. So that's one. In the second variety of data, if say something is publicly accessible, but you know by context that this is meant to be something that's not discoverable, say someone writing very privately on a grief blog, or someone very privately sharing nude selfies on a very private Tumblr, then I think here you have to navigate permissions with that person and the context very carefully. And in writing up the ethics for your proposal, you also reframe all of these things differently. Is searchability important? How do you want to identify or de-identify people? How are you going to make yourself known as a researcher? Are you just going to astroturf and look, or do you want to signify that above and beyond participating, you publicly state that you are also researching them and looking at them from a different eye? In the second stage, which is data collection, I think the biggest concern I have is with metadata. Like if I don't need this information, I'm not going to collect it, even if it's available to me. I would prefer for the data bytes to not be able to be traceable or trackable in a coherent whole, such that in a worst case scenario, if there's like a major university leak, I would hate for any of my informants to feel doxxed or to feel that anything was compromised, even if I anonymized them, just because there was enough context for people to piece together their identities. And then archiving is also another issue with data collection. Where are you saving the things that you are archiving? For some instances, I have used Tumblrs to reblock posts that I'm studying. So it's a neat archive publicly of all the things I'm looking at. For others, it may be a list on Twitter or an Instagram account where I follow people whom I'm studying, and they can all check each other out by virtue of my profile. For others, it may just be screen grabs on me taking notes that's private to myself. And these are decisions I make depending on the research question. And then lastly, the analysis and writing up process, I think 2 key things are important. The representation. Say if you are writing up data that you've collected 2 years from now, or in my research field, 2 months from away, which is super old. Do you still want to give the context of that person in that time? You know, hey, pre-pandemic, this was my persona, but here in July, all of these things no longer apply. If I were to still use that data, I am now obliged to add representation or to contextualize them in a different way so that people understand that there is timeliness and a shelf life to the things they're sharing and the things I'm also showing. Because more often than not, a lot of internet scholars find that when we make our informants public, people trace them online and then start harassing them for things they may have said in different time in a different context. So you want to be as sensitive to that, especially if your informants are like mine, who prefer to be named in public. And then the second thing is probably searchability. If you're quoting things word for word, if you are reproducing memes and pictures, these days it's so easy to do reverse searches and find the source. So you have to consider things like Annette Markham refers to this as fabrication. It's ethical fabrication to ensure that you break up or hide the traces so that if you need to break a searchable route, you do that for your research informants. So this could be like a semester-long lecture, but I will hand off over to my panelist, Shanthi, and maybe we can continue from there.
Yeah, I think there's so much there, and I think Crystal's done a fantastic job of identifying what the really key and critical issues are when you're collecting data in an online environment and you're using, you know, analysis of all of this digital content that's created through people's digital lives. I think what I could maybe contribute here is to talk about, okay, what are the ethical issues that might arise if, like many people now, you need to sort of replicate a face-to-face fieldwork encounter in a digital space. So if you were originally going to go out into the field and interview people, and now you're doing online interviews or doing Facebook focus groups via Zoom or something like that. So that's very different kind of context to what Crystal's referred to. And in this kind of context, I would say don't panic too much about ethics, because I think all the basic principles of ethics in that research encounter, if it was face-to-face, they still apply in the same way in the online environment around informed consent. So a lot of the basic stuff you've put in place with your ethics is absolutely still going to apply if you're transferring an interview or a focus group encounter into an online space. I would say, obviously, it depends who your participants are, what you might need to think through, and anything around, you know, accessibility, digital skills, connectivity. You really need to think about your participant group and think, well, if I move this online, who maybe then is not going to be able to participate in the research in an equal way? And there might need to be accessibility things that you need to sort of think through there. Also, again, you know, are there any privacy or surveillance issues like built into the tech that you might be using as well is something to consider too. Do participants need to sign up to use this? What kind of data is not just going to you as a researcher, but might be going into any kind of commercial platform or tool that you might be using to collect the data? So that's one to kind of think about. I'm definitely experimenting at this point in my career with actually using commercial applications. So tools and platforms that were basically designed for market research as forms of digital ethnography. And so that requires really careful talking through with the providers of that tool to make sure that the things that they have in place around privacy and data security align with not only your own kind of personal ethical requirements, the ethical requirements of the research, but also the ethical requirements of the university as well. So that takes a little bit of thinking through there. But yeah, kind of, I just want to also second, you know, Crystal's point that you can be creative in the way you write a content as well, and that more sort of data doesn't have to be presented verbatim to be analytically rigorous as well. And I think that's an extremely important point Crystal made, which certainly I never learnt throughout my methods education as an undergrad. So that's a really, just want to reiterate that as a point as well.
Great point. Thanks, Shanthi. Ben?
I think both Crystal and Shanthi make really, really excellent points. And there's definitely whole units worth of material just in that, as Crystal said. Just to maybe mention something different to kind of consider as well is a lot of the digital stuff is going to be stuck within, similar to kind of what Shanthi says, but a slightly different direction. You're going to be stuck within the terms and conditions, you know, all of the fine print of the services that you're using, regardless of whether there's kind of a potential surveillance or exploitation kind of concern within that. I have a fun anecdote that's entirely within the university system, so I think it's fine to talk about. But my undertakings with using like scraping kind of tools are fairly mundane and not that exciting. But I got a fairly firm rap over the knuckles from both my library and a service that they use for a database, for using a browser extension that allowed me to download things faster. Essentially, the issue there, I guess, is that I'm creating a database, which is actually the product that that service was selling to the library in the first place. So therefore, I'm not allowed to do it. And I guess while I don't really necessarily agree ethically with what's happening there, I can understand the kind of logic behind that argument. So you kind of have to bear that in mind on a kind of case by case basis as well. And I think I've maybe toned back my cynicism a little bit in the current climate, because we are seeing companies that are doing their best to keep things running when servers are overloading and people are trying new things and trying to find new ways to connect in the middle of the pandemic. And I would hate to be the person responsible for that kind of issue in this kind of environment. So I think it's kind of something to kind of consider in that mix of like intentionality and audiences and stuff as well when people are sharing their content through those terms and conditions.
Thanks, Ben. Akane?
Hi. I think everyone has covered the practicalities really well at all these different stages. So I thought I would just say that sometimes something that helps me in terms of just principles and trying to think through ethics, because I've just had a look at the chat question, and honestly, I've never really been stopped from doing anything in relation to digital methods. And I think for a lot of us, you have to kind of decide what you think is the best way to both deal with your participants, you know, yourselves, because, you know, an ethics committee is not necessarily going to be the final arbiter on what is actually, you know, politically appropriate or good for your project. But I just wanted to share something I've found really useful, because sometimes I have found that in discussion of ethics, because we, you know, want to make sure that we do the best we can with and be true to our participants' stories, and, you know, there are all these questions about integrity and privacy. Sometimes I think it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking you're doing your research for your participants, your direct participants, but your participants are very important to your research. You can't do it without them, but they are just representatives of a larger group, a larger social phenomenon, a larger, you know, and your responsibility as a researcher is not just to them, but also to producing knowledge with some kind of social benefit. And there's an article that I read by this scholar, Richard Nager. I'm just going to find the reference and paste it into the chat, who I think when I read this, I thought she just puts it so beautifully. But she talks about, we can get really caught up in thinking, am I an ethical researcher? Am I doing ethics right? But she kind of focuses the question on, is what I produce of social benefit, is it communicated so it will help not just, you know, my own participants, but, you know, a broader group of people. So that's, yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
Thank you, Akane. Look, I want to switch over to a bit more of an open discussion in 1 second. So I'm just going to pause the recording so we can go off the record. To those of you who are listening to this recording, hopefully you found that useful.